Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Today I'm going to cover The Art of Teaching by Gilbert Highet. This is book 38 from my 2024 reading list. Well, it's December. That means I'm in my winter break. And that's when I get a lot of reading done of newer books or books that have been suggested to me. And this is one of those books. There is a teacher here in town. He teaches at the local high school. His name is Bill Leachman. And he said, you've got to get this book. We get together, we talk books, we get coffee, and we just talk ideas and books and all that. And he teaches Latin here in the town where I live. He also teaches some great books to his students. And I've gone in and spoken to his class a few times. And one thing I can say is that this man is loved by his students. And so I think of Bill, I think of him as a teacher, but he gave me he suggested this book to me, and he said, you are a teacher. And I bristled at that a little bit because I don't consider myself a teacher. In my mind, a teacher is someone who is confined to a building, be it a schoolhouse, a high school, a college, a university, and those are the teachers, the professional teachers. But what this book shows is that we are all teachers. We're also all learners, but we are all teachers. And it might be teaching our spouses, our children, our clients, our employees, podcast listeners, readers. We're all teaching, but we're all on the flip side of that as well, in that we're all learning. And that may seem obvious, but one big shift in my mind just reading this book was just even allowing myself to consider that I am a teacher, whether it's through this podcast, whether it's with my daughters, always teaching. And it's a high task. It's an important task, and we should put the utmost importance on the teaching of those who are closest to us, be it a spouse, children, those who are dearest and closest to us. And so this is an important task. It's not to be treated lightly. And just that idea of thinking of everyone as a teacher was a big shift in my mind. One thing that I love about reading is just comparing what I think a book is going to be about to what it actually is about. And so with this one, I just thought, this is for the teacher. So I'll learn about how teaching is to be done and what should be taught and those kind of things. And that's a very small part of what this book is about. And in fact, at the very beginning, the author says that this is not a book about what should be taught, but how. And so he goes through the methods of teaching, and he shows what famous teachers throughout history have done, be it Socrates, Aristotle, Jesus. He goes through all these different teaching methods to show how they taught, how they influenced, and even looks at their students and how they went about their lives after being taught. So very interesting in that. Just want to highlight a few other big things that happen in this book, just to give a scope of what would be involved if you were to read this book, which I hope you do. So first is just the importance of planning as a teacher, of knowing how long you have for a class. He says just countless teachers do not plan ahead in the sense of, all right, this is how much time we have. Let's say we need to read a whole book in that time. Just even planning it out to where you read the necessary chapters to complete it in time, that sort of thing. But just how crucial that is in teaching. So that's just one thing that comes up. He makes the comment of always read the sources. Everything flows from them naturally, and then talks about the students who, or the teachers who have focused on secondary materials as opposed to the sources, but just how important it is to always read the source material, be that the great books or those kind of works as opposed to the works talking about the great books. He gives ideas on just basic things of like practicing lectures or practicing speeches for the purpose of them seeming spontaneous, and just gives some different ideas on how to do that. He shares ways to introduce competition into the classroom and how gives examples of how that can spur learning. He shows the importance of tradition in a school. And just I find it interesting because in the last podcast episode, I commented on in Xenophon in how the reputation of an army was so important. The tradition of an army, the reputation of a country, the traditions that a army would have, and how important that was to the people in that army. And so here you have a very similar idea of just how tradition in a school can spur others on, whether it's even looking at someone and saying they were in this exact classroom and they partook of these same things, and look where they ended up, that kind of thing. The other thing, just at the very end, he talks about the importance of fathers in teaching and what they can impart on their children. So I was very convicted by that chapter, and just it just made me want to do better as a father in how I'm relating and teaching my daughters. So that's just some of the things that this book gets into. I'll go into a few more of those in the next segment. And then also in that next segment, I want to talk about some ideas, but then share some examples from my own life of teachers I've had or ways I've been taught and how that's influenced me. And so just even seeing things in this book and then relating them to stories in my own life. And then in the final segment, I will cover the one thing, my key takeaway from this book. As for the reading stats, I read this between December 5th and 13th. It's a 250-page book, and I averaged about 28 pages per day. It took me 7 hours and 45 minutes total to read the book. I know that's nerdy and dorky to share that, but I like just knowing how long books take. And then I want you to know, because I read rather slowly, just to give you an idea, like, hey, just rough time frame, this is what you're looking at if you decide to read this book. 7 hour and 45 minutes may seem like a long time, but if you always carry a book with you, if you just don't watch TV for an evening or cut back on the phone time, that 7 hours and 45 minutes can add up pretty quickly. As for initial thoughts on this book, it's a really good book. If you are a teacher as a profession, this is a no-brainer. You just pick it up and read it now. But more than that, if you think you might get into teaching at some point, read this. It will definitely convince you that you are already a teacher. But even if you're not even thinking about, if you kind of came into it like I did, somebody telling me that I'm a teacher, me kind of bristling at that, this is a good book just to convince you that you are teaching continually those around you. And just even taking on that identity of I am a teacher, I think there's something powerful in that. So I hope I convince you through the rest of this episode to pick up this book, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. So next up, segment 2, and some of the things that stuck out and how I have seen those things in my own life. I used to take trips as a single man, and I would be in these just grand locations, and I'd be taking it all in and just thinking, gosh, I want to share this with someone. And what this book does is it shows you that just how closely tied learning and teaching are. And so in that same type of scenario where I see something beautiful and I want to share it with someone else, the same thing goes for learning. So if you love learning, you're probably naturally going to be a teacher or desire to teach. There's just something in us that when we learn something cool, when we connect two things, we want to share it with others. And so there's this natural tendency to share. And so one of the key points that comes right at the beginning of this book is that teaching is inseparable from learning. And he just says the best teachers are those who are going to continually be wanting to learn more. So I wanted to read a few other quotes along those lines. Here, the good teacher is a man or woman of exceptionally wide and lively intellectual interests. Continuing on, the teacher's job is understanding a large and important area of the world's activity and achievement and making it viable for the young. End quote. I want to read this last part, this comes up later in the book. I thought this was an excellent way of thinking about this. Instead of teaching French, he would teach France. This throws a great deal on the teacher. It means he must be a man of wide culture. It means he must be creatively interested in everything about his subject and be ready to discuss it. But teachers can do this. Again and again, the men of the Renaissance praised their schoolmasters as universal minds, eloquent as Cicero, wise as Socrates, fountains and treasure houses of knowledge. And I'll end the quote there. And this book was written a while ago, I think before women existed. So everything says he, but just know that that means he and she there. So, but I love that. Instead of teaching French, he would teach France. And just this idea of if you are a French teacher, like teaching the French language at a school, your job is not to just share that language. Your job is to share France. So what does that mean for you as a teacher? It means you are listening to French music. It means you are trying as much as you can to get over to France to experience it firsthand. It means you're probably watching French movies. It means you are trying to learn how to cook French food. It means becoming enmeshed in this world and not just imparting one part of it, but seeking to learn everything about it so that your teaching is infused with France as opposed to just the French language. I loved that distinction, and it's really helpful just in thinking of teaching. Next thing that really stuck out to me is the descriptions of different types of teaching, and one of those being the tutorial system. And so the first system that he goes into is lecturing. The second is the tutorial system, and then the third is where the student will prepare something, so maybe reading a book, and then get together and discuss it in class. But the tutorial system is something that I came in contact with in the middle of college. And so for most of my life, I had experienced the lecture system where there was a teacher that would get in front of the class, lecture, we'd take notes, we would learn. And then I did a little bit, depending on the topic too, of that third type of teaching. But I had never encountered the tutorial system. And between my sophomore and junior years of college, I was introduced to the tutorial system by spending a summer at Oxford. And so before I talk about my experience, let me just share what is in this book about the tutorial system. So here we go. It started a very long time ago. Here we go. But Socrates was the first who thought that teaching might mean not pouring new ideas into an entirely empty brain, but drawing out universal truths from the mind in which they already lay concealed. All his teaching was done by conversation. He merely asked questions. The other man was led on to answer. End quote. Later on in that same page, this system is the most difficult, the least common, and the most thorough way to teach. It is the most difficult because it demands constant alertness, invariable good humor, complete earnestness, and utter self-surrender to the cause of truth on both the part of the teacher and the pupil. End quote. I love that. I love that. This came from Socrates, and I love this idea that it's not pouring new ideas into an entirely empty brain, but drawing out universal truths from the mind in which they already lay concealed. I mean, you could split the world in two just by that of which way people think people learn, whether they're empty brains or whether it's this drawing out of universal truths that exist but lay concealed. And the tutorial system is brilliant at that aspect of drawing out. And so at Oxford, when I was there, I was in a course with three other students. Two. So there'd be three students total with an Oxford Don, which is just a fancy word for professor. And so we'd get together with this Oxford Don. And so I had two courses, 1 hour a week. I thought I would just have all the free time in the world, 2 hours of class a week over the summer. This is going to be grand. I get there and they hand you 7 books to read by the next course, or by the next class the next week. So yes, 1 hour of class a week, but 7 books to read in between that. We then prepared a paper, and one of the 3 students would read the paper, and then the Oxford Don and the other 2 students would ask questions on that paper. So you can't just write everything you know in that paper. You turn that paper in, you read it, but then you are asked additional questions. So you've got to know more than what you put in that paper, or you've just got to be fresh on your feet to be able to connect things based on the questions that are being asked of you. And I loved this system. I loved this way of learning. I had been accustomed to getting a textbook that thus saith the textbook, and what is in there is what is right. But it's kind of, it would compile information, but you're reading one book as opposed to reading 7 different viewpoints on the same topic. By book 2 or 3, you know what you think. You've seen the arguments. You can you can argue either side of it because you're reading all the different sides of it. And it's an incredible way to learn. I'm so thankful I was introduced to it. And it was neat to read about it in comparison to the other types of teaching. It is the most difficult, both on the teacher side and on the student side, but it is rich, and it is directly led to this reading project for me, just in the way I was taught. And I love it. So I loved coming across it in this book. All right. Page 160 here. There's a great quote I want to go over here. What a teacher says outright sometimes goes unheard. What he stimulates his pupils to think out for themselves often has a far more potent influence upon them. End quote. Well, that should seem like the most obvious thing alive, or obvious thing in the world. Is just just think back to your own education and the teachers who were the best. Was it the person droning on in the front of the class, and maybe you caught every now and then something that they said, or was it the person that stimulated you to read a certain book or explore a certain topic or attempt a new type of math problem or science experiment? It was those teachers that stimulated you. And that is a key point in this book, that one of the teacher's main jobs is stimulation, not to just throw out information and hope it goes into the ear and into the brain, but it's to stimulate. And I love that idea. And it changes how you think about teaching as well. You may have the answer. You may know the answer. And this is part of this tutorial system. You as the teacher, you almost want to hide the answer. You don't want to just tell it outright. You want to stimulate that student that they come to the answer themselves, because they will remember it. It will spur them on to further learning, but it does require great humility of the teacher, not to always seem like the smart one. And you think just of Socrates and how he taught and how he was just always asking questions. And he could have lectured. He could have said, "This is how it is. I'm one of the smartest people in town here." But he would do that way of stimulation as opposed to just saying it outright. Last thing I want to read here is something about adult learning. And this is a good chunk of text here. It's about half a paragraph, but listen along in this. I love this. The process of adult learning, as far as we know, does not involve increase in the size of the brain, but does mean that the paths and connections within it become at once clearer and more complex. The territory already held is explored and mapped, or, to use another image, the intricate machine grows capable of more and more skills as the operator finds his way about it. The mind which is exercised on books is not being strained and stretched. It is being used for its proper purpose. To smother it with newspaper pulp, shiny clay magazines, and gossip so as to keep it from bursting is like keeping the eyes shut all day to rest them. End quote. I love that so much. I actually had the thought before this reading project, and especially before getting into the great books, like, will it be too much? Like, does there come a point of too much reading or too much learning? And I just love this, that is using the brain for its proper purpose. Alternatively, if it's always going on lesser material like TV shows, or what he says here of newspaper pulp, shiny clay magazines, or gossip, that is what strains the brain. That is what is not using it for its proper purpose. The proper purpose is to make these connections, to read and to go deeper. And I loved that part in that description on the learning side of things, but then also just thinking on the stimulation side of that as well. How do you stimulate someone to get into these things, to explore the great books, to explore new areas of learning? Those are some of my main areas that I loved in this book. Next segment, I'll cover my one thing that I thought was just the greatest in this book. All All right, my favorite part of this whole book was the part that talked about how Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. So I'm going to read a few sections from this. So this is what Aristotle taught. First, and most important, he taught him to respect and love Greek culture. He began with Homer. This was a splendid choice, for the original heroes of Homer were very much like the Macedonians, and Homer idealized them so skillfully that they became fine patterns for the young prince to follow. Naturally, Alexander most admired the northerner Achilles, said to be his ancestor. He visited the old mound believed to be Achilles' tomb outside Troy and held a memorial service at it. He took with him everywhere a copy of Homer revised by his tutor, and once he said he envied Achilles for having such a poet to write of his adventures. He evidently thought of himself as a new Achilles, conquering the rich old cities of Asia. Let me jump ahead. Wherever he went, so this is speaking of Alexander, wherever he went, he founded cities on the Greek model and spread the knowledge of Greek arts, sciences, language, literature, manners, and trade, not as an extension of the Greek nation, but as the best way to establishing a worldwide civilization. Further on, nearly 400 years later, the Christian gospel was preached in Greek and written in Greek, and the Roman Empire's strongest and longest survival was in the Greek-dominated Near East because of the cultural mission which Aristotle helped to teach Alexander the Great. Further on, this is the last part. Instead, he taught him something of the virtue most important in a monarch, generosity, which Aristotle himself called greatness of soul. I'll stop reading there. I jumped around, but those are my favorite parts. And just, it was so neat to see this line of thought. And so Aristotle is starting with Homer in his education of Alexander. Alexander is conquering huge swaths of areas, and then putting Greek culture and literature and language and art and trade into these areas. This established this worldwide civilization that then was where the Christian gospel was preached, and where it said, because of the cultural mission which Aristotle helped to teach Alexander the Great. I just love that, just kind of pulling that thread, seeing that line through from Homer to Aristotle to Alexander to the Christian gospel to us today. I just thought that was brilliant. And another part kind of tied in with that, the author of this book talks about how important it is to have Greek reason and the prophets of the Hebrews. So here we go with this. The Greek teachers claimed to be following the movement of reason. The Hebrew prophets knew they were uttering the voice of God. We admire both, but we are apt to think that while a group of men who are in touch with God can change the world by a rare and miraculous intervention, it needs the steady work of reason to keep the place going and to train the young. So I love that, just the distinction there between the Hebrew prophet and the Greek philosopher. So let me close out with just a few things. One is some consolation to us older gentlemen. And here's a quote. One of the consolations of old age is that while the body becomes weaker, the mind can grow stronger and richer. I love that. I for a while had in my head that I would go to university. I'd get this education. It would teach me a trade. And that would be the end of the learning part of my life. And then I would be working and just, I would work, everything that I knew I needed to know for my job, I would have learned in school. And I know it's a silly idea, but it was in there somewhere. It was in my head. And what I've come to realize instead is that life is a constant learning. And there are teachers we go to, and we are constantly teaching as well. And so I loved that while the body becomes weaker, the mind can grow stronger and richer. We can have this intellectually stimulating life into old age. We can keep that going even as other things in us and around us deteriorate. And that is a nice consolation of old age. So what is the goal of teaching? I said it's to stimulate, but it's also to do this. And I thought this was a great explanation. There's a part talking about Rabelais' Gargantua book, and there's a part that talks about the ideal school for young men and women. And it says it's where they did what they should do because they wanted to, not because they were compelled. that being the goal of education, to train young men and women so that they do what they should do because they want to, not because they were compelled to do it. It's a great thing to strive for. Last thing here that I loved is it's just kind of an offhand statement. It was actually in parentheses, but they're talking about books and which books to read. And it said this one student read Greek only for 5 years in the books, and that he could pick up any book. And when he says this in parentheses, it says an immortal book, a permanently valuable book. And I loved that idea. I love it. Just as I'm going through these great books, I love that description of them being immortal books, a permanently valuable book. So let me close off with that, of you thinking about the immortal books. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Let me share with you a 2025 reading group that I would love for you to be a part of. Maybe you have a hard time with the great books or just even desiring to get into them, and they may seem overwhelming. So what I'm going to do this upcoming year is lead a reading group, both in person and online, where we go through short, great books. These are books that you can probably get through between 2 and 5 hours, and we're just doing one a month. And so if you live in the Franklin, Tennessee or Nashville area, you can come and we'll do it in person on the second Monday of each month. Or if you want to do it online, that will be the Wednesday following the second Monday of each month. So I will link in the show notes to this reading group, and I would love for you to be a part of it. And so it'll share the details of what books we'll be going through, and it will also have how you can get involved, and it'll show the dates that we'll be meeting. But I would love for you to be a part of this. It will be meeting on Wednesdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Central Time. So no matter where you are, you can join in. We'll meet via Zoom, and we'll just discuss these short, great books. So for example, the first one in January will be The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest works that we have. The book for February will be Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And that is one of my favorite books that I've read for this reading project. And so we'll cover one a month. I hope you join. To get involved, all you have to do is become a paid subscriber on the Books of Titan Substack. And I have plans for as little as $5 per month, or $99 per year, or $500 per year. So for just $5 a month, you can join this reading group. And you don't have to do all of them. You can jump in and out on the books that you want to read and discuss. So think about that for the new year. Just get you in the process of reading some of the great books, getting introduced to some of the great literature. We'll go through some Greek tragedies. We'll close with A Christmas Carol by Dickens in December, and it should be a great time. So I do hope you will consider that and join. I also released my 2025 reading list, and I've got that on the Books of Titans website now. And so next year is going to be really fun. I'm going to be closing out the Greek tragedies, moving on to a little bit of Greek history, and then closing out the plays with some Greek comedies by Aristophanes. After that, I will be going into the Greek philosophers. So something I've always been a little scared of in my life, just philosophy. But I'm hoping now, just after having read Homer and some of the tragedy writers, that I'll have a better entryway into Greek philosophy by Plato and Aristotle. So looking forward to 2025. I think it's going to be great. I've got a few more books on my list for winter break here in December, and then I kick off January 2025 with reading straight through the King James Version of the Bible. This is how I start every year, just reading a different version of the Bible. It usually takes me 2 months. So January and February, I just set aside. It's the only thing I'm reading, and I just go straight through. I will be adding the Apocrypha this year. So every other year I read the Apocrypha with the Bible. So I'm using the Barry Moser edition of the Bible. He's an illustrator and then also designer. So he designed the layout of the Bible, but then he also has all these just incredible illustrations. So I look forward to sharing those illustrations with you, sharing my favorite ones on Instagram and Twitter, and then just going through the Bible again. March, then I will start back up with the great books. So thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you decide to read The Art of Teaching. If you are a teacher, definitely read it. If you are not a teacher, you actually are a teacher. That's the fun thing about this book. And maybe this book can help convince you of that, like it did me. If you have something you would like to share with me personally, you can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com. That's Eric with a K. But if you have something to share about this episode, please do that on Substack. You don't have to pay to do that. You can just be a regular subscriber. But that will create a conversation on that post about this, or the podcast post about this episode. So other people could see that and then respond to it as well. So I love the idea of creating conversations around these episodes. And I'd love to hear what you have to say, or something that maybe this sparked in you. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter at Books of Titans. And the Substack is booksoftitans.com. My reading lists and great books reading lists and all that is at books.booksoftitans.com. I'll be back next week to discuss another book from this year's reading list. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.